my name is Christoph. I'm an assistant professor at the University of St. Gallen in the finance department. And today I want to talk to you about how to pay with central bank digital money. And in particular, I want to talk about a market-based approach to CBDC payment systems. So I should say this is joint work with Tariq Rukni, who is at MIT Media Lab. I should also say that this is still preliminary work and it's incomplete. So if you have any constructive feedback on how to improve this proposal and the way we model it, that we very much appreciate it. So let me jump in straight away with an overview. Okay? So what is the question that we are trying to answer here? So the question we ask is how to design from scratch a payment system, so that could be for retail customers or for wholesale customers, for a central bank digital currency that is efficient, secure, and under the control of the central bank. Okay? These are essentially our main criteria that we try to fulfill, and I'll make them more specific as we go through the presentation. And the essence of our proposal is very simple. There are three ingredients, basically. Okay? So we have these account balances, and they're stored in a ledger, and that's distributed across some licensed verifiers. So that's a very important sort of detail. They're licensed. There's not just anybody who can join the system. And then akin to online ad auctions, if there is a transaction that comes in, that is then auctioned off to a subset of these verifiers, and then the verifiers go about checking the transaction's validity, and if it's valid, they add it to this ledger. Okay? This ledger doesn't have to be a blockchain, can be anything. We don't really worry about this in our proposal. And then, so what's the role of the central bank? The central bank goes out and licenses verifiers, so decides who to admit into the system, and it sets the rules of the game and tries to enforce these rules. Okay? And then if there is some ambiguity among the outcome of the verification process among the set of miners that were working on a particular transaction, the central bank goes in and resolves the dispute. It's essentially the arbiter of last resort. Okay? And this has some nice properties. So this is basically a qualitative proposal, but then we try to make it more rigorous through a model, and we show that there's economic inefficiency in the sense that verifier competition through this auction drives down the fees that are charged on the transactions. It's secure in the sense that verifier shirking is unprofitable, and it's also detectable by the central bank. And then finally, the control aspect is there so that the central bank retains control over the system, both in terms of who has access to it and what are the rules of the system. We believe that these are the key ingredients to a payment system for a central bank digital currency. We believe that a central bank, for example, would never be open to a system that would be outside of its control. That would, it would not hand over the payment system to the Bitcoin network, for example. That would be out of the question. So these are the constraints that we try to address within this proposal. So you may think, there are already so many payment systems out there. Why do we need to rethink payments? What's the problem? And if you think that, maybe you haven't been following the Sun or in other British tabloid media sufficiently closely over the last couple of weeks, because if you did, then you'd have heard about the cardtastrophe, which happened a couple of weeks ago, the 1st of June, or 2nd of June actually, when the Visa network had some major malfunction in the UK, and lots of people were not able to pay, lots of people were not able to go into KFC, get their fried chicken, or go to McDonald's and so on. So lots of people were actually upset in the UK about this. Merchants lost money on this day when the Visa network broke down. And it was partially due to the fact that in the UK, most cards actually run on Visa. Okay? It's just a very, very dominant player in this retail payment system. Okay, so if you take a closer look at payments and how they're done right now in most economies, okay, it's that you'll notice that there are essentially two types of payments providers. There is the private providers, and they can do retail or wholesale payments like Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and then Alipay, which I don't know very much about, but obviously it's a big player in China. And these providers have really embraced user experience. I can use my contactless Visa, go pay in London, tap in at the tube, just get my coffee. It's very seamless, okay, for me from a user's perspective. But then if you look under the hood, at the back end, these systems can be actually quite inefficient in terms of settlement in particular. I won't go into much detail. I'll just show you this picture, which is supposed to explain the Visa settlement process, and which can take up to 5 days, okay? And, you know, just looking at it, it looks quite complicated, okay? Too complicated for me to explain it to you, at least right now. And then there's another aspect, which is arguably the more important one, which is that payment systems are naturally prone to network effects, okay? Which then has a tendency towards concentration in these markets, which is why, you know, for example, Visa has such a strong dominant position in the UK, and therefore makes the UK payment system, retail payment system, susceptible to problems within the Visa network. Okay, and we're not the first to say this, obviously. There are papers out there, and even already in 2006, okay, the European Commission raised concerns about the level of competition within the card payments space, okay. They say there's restrictions to new entry, that charge high fees, you know, they have a lot of pricing power over merchants and so on. So these are problems that people have recognized, that are out there, but they still haven't been addressed. So then these are the private providers, then you have the public providers. The public providers are essentially central banks. They run systems for interbank payments, okay? These are within the Eurozone, for example, Target 2. Within the US, that would be Fedwire, or within the UK, CHAPS, okay? And they're designed for efficient processing of very large transactions, but they're relatively infrequent, okay? And if you then at least want to consider opening up the payment system to a larger audience, as you might want to do if you were to introduce a central bank digital currency, you know, you'd wonder, well, maybe the potential from central banks to innovate and to scale up their systems to large-scale throughput maybe is not given, okay? And just looking at the numbers, right now the Target 2 network, for example, processes about 4 transactions per second, whereas the Visa network processes 1,600 transactions per second. That's in terms of just the number of transactions that go through. Then, you know, the settlement actually does take longer in Visa, as I just showed you before. Okay, and then there's obviously cryptocurrencies. We heard the Crypto Valley conference, so need to mention cryptocurrencies as well. And there are some interesting innovations out there that come from this space, okay? So first of all, it's an open system. I think, you know, it's an open payment system, anybody can join it, and at least in principle, you might think that that could lead to a reduction in concentration, or sort of something that prevents concentration in the system. Where we've learned that from Bitcoin, at least, this is not necessarily the case. There's the innovation of the decentralized ledger, right? And then for us, what was very interesting to see is that fees are essentially set in a market mechanism. Whereas, you know, if you have an effective monopoly such as Visa, or a public utility such as Target 2, the fees are essentially set, and then all transactions are just processed at the same fee. Okay? But in Bitcoin, that's a little bit different. In Bitcoin, if you have an urgent transaction that you want added to the blockchain quickly, you'd go and add a higher fee. Okay? So it's a kind of a market system that sets the fees. And then we all know, though, that, you know, cryptocurrencies have little used for payments right now in developed economies, at least. The consensus protocol is often costly and inefficient. We just heard, you know, all the costs of electricity and hardware that goes into the mining process. So that's not something that we want to replicate if you wanted to scale something at the level of a whole economy that would, you know, work from a central bank's perspective, at least. And so where do these central bank digital currencies come in? Okay. First of all, I should say that it just opens the debate. So it just opens the debate and allows us to think more broadly about how one could go about redesigning the system. And it actually opens the debate so far that right now nobody really knows what a central bank digital currency is, right? So if you read the papers from the BIS, for example, on this topic, the easiest way or the best way that they could go about defining what a CBDC is by saying what it is not, okay? They say, for example, a CBDC is a digital form of central bank money that is different from balances in traditional reserve or settlement accounts, okay? That's basically all they say. And this sort of huge uncertainty around what a CBDC actually is then leaves the space open for a lot of debate. So there would be people who say, you know, CBDCs are awesome because they can give access to a fairer system by widening access to safe central bank reserves. Okay, they could say, we can now do more flexible monetary policy. We can do things like helicopter money. We can just credit anybody we want $100 in their account. We can have negative rates without no problem, or we can have more efficient payment systems. Okay? All these are things that a proponent might say. But then an opponent would say, well, no, you know, CBDC would just compete with normal bank deposits, and then if there's a financial crisis, there would just be a massive run from the bank deposits to the central bank digital currencies to just like make the whole problem of financial stability much worse. then it would also transfer operational responsibility from private players to the central bank. The central bank may not be actually the best person to do all of this. Central bank is just not an expert in running maybe a retail payment system. And then all of these efficiency gains, they're just uncertain and they may be small. Okay, so why should we tinker with the system that works? Okay, our bottom line is here that the pros and cons are really highly contingent on the actual implementation. It really just depends on what's your actual proposal. And so our take on this is what we need is a clear proposal. Yes? Sorry? No, please. Well, I don't think you would reward them at the bond interest. I mean, you could reward them at whatever rate the central bank deposit rate would be. Right. Right. Okay. So I guess I sort of wanted to get this. So I will actually during this presentation not talk very much about monetary policy. This is sort of outside the scope of our paper, but I take your point. Okay. So what we say is we need clear proposals. So this is what we're trying to do in this paper. In fact, we want to make a proposal for a payment system. Okay. So the way this presentation will be structured is that we have one part where I'll try to explain the proposal in plain words, okay? I'll go through the scope and the problem definition, and I'll go through a little bit more detail what the requirements are in our mind of a central bank digital currency, and then I'll go through the proposal. And then in the second step, I'll sort of shift gears a little bit, and then I'll introduce a very simple model of this proposal. And then we can use that to sort of slightly more rigorously argue why we think this proposal is a good one. So if you think about a CBDC, okay, there are three big things that kind of come to your mind, okay? There's the access regime, there's the monetary policy regime, and there's the payment regime, okay? And obviously all of these three ones are important, okay? Arguably, one could say that the monetary policy regime and the access regime are the more contentious ones, okay? The ones where people would fight more about, okay? And to some extent, that's true. So we would, we try to stay clear of those contentious issues, and we try to focus on something where we think we can make a contribution, and that is within the payments regime. So what our proposal will try to do is will not answer the question of how will monetary policy be done in the CBDC. We will not talk about who has access to this, but what we will talk about is who maintains and stores the ledger of the CBDC. How are transactions verified? Who checks the validity of these transactions? Who takes care of anti-money laundering and so on? And who pays for these transactions? How are transaction fees set? Okay. So now put yourself in the position you are at the drawing board and you can design the payment system for a CBDC from scratch. What would be your design requirements? And that's essentially the question that we asked ourselves, okay? So Tarek and myself, we sat down and we thought, well, there's one thing what it should do, and it should be efficient, okay? It should be efficient in the sense that transactions should be cheap and they should be fast, okay? But they should also be efficient in another sense. Namely, that if somebody has a really urgent transaction, they should be able, to have that prioritized, but at a cost. That should be more expensive. So if I, want to have a transaction that I don't really mind whether it takes 5 days, if I send money to my sister, I can put this in as a very low urgency transaction. But if I need to transfer money now because I'm late on my credit card payments, in a world where there are no more credit cards, then I have a high priority and might be willing to, pay a higher fee for this. So how would you achieve this? Well, typically how you go about achieving economic efficiency, well, you try to have some sort of a competitive market, okay? Then second thing we thought was, well, you would want the system to be secure, right? Not surprisingly. And secure in what sense? It should be the ledger that you have, that you operate, it should be tamper evident. If somebody messes with it, you should be able to observe it. In particular, the central bank should be able to do this, okay? And then the verifiers, so the guys who are actually doing the job, okay, in our model, they should have minimal incentives to tamper or to manipulate the ledger. Okay, so you need to design the incentives in the right way. And then there's the other aspect, which is resilience, to sort of partial outage or, hardened against cyber attack. I put these into brackets because we don't really deal with this in any detail. So how would you achieve it? Security in this sense, as I defined it, we would say, well, you need well-designed incentives and targeted checks. Okay, targeted checks by the central bank on what is going on. And then finally, you have control. That's a pretty obvious one. Okay, it should be the central bank that sets and enforces the rules. It should not be some random community of people, some consortium of maybe industry partners that decides how this payment system is run. No, it's under the control of the central bank, and they set the rule and enforce them. Okay, and then finally, the central bank should have the last word in the verification dispute. And how do we achieve this? Well, you have a permission system that is administered by the central bank. Okay, so remember the goal is, we want to maintain a ledger of accounts in such a way that funds can be transferred efficiently and securely from one account to the other. That's just a very simple goal that we try to achieve. The participants in our system are of three types. So the users, you and me, the guys who have accounts and want to transfer money from one account to the other. And then there are the license verifiers. These are the guys that do the work, okay, that actually work on verifying the transactions, and we think of them typically as private entities. Okay, it could be a technology firm that decides to provide this kind of service. Okay, don't really specify them in any detail, but think of them just as private entities. Okay, and then we have the central bank, who is kind of the administrator of this system. And then we have a very simple verification protocol. Okay, so a transaction arrives, the user submits this transaction, say I want to submit money to my sister, and I say it's not very urgent, so I indicate the urgency and I indicate the maximum transaction fee that I'm willing to pay for this transaction. Then what the central bank will do is they will run a second price auction among the available verifiers in the system, okay? Very much like the way you would see an online ad auction work, okay? And then they just select the K most competitive verifiers and allocate the job of verifying this transaction to the K verifiers. So K verifiers will be working in parallel on this transaction. So if they all agree on the outcome, if they all agree this is a valid transaction, then they will add it to the ledger, it will be accepted, and everybody, all of the other verifiers that were not working on it, will copy the state, okay? If the verifiers disagree, then the central bank will step in and will actually go and check the output, will do the verification itself, and if it turns out that one of the verifiers that disagreed with the outcome of the central bank cheated, then this verifier will have to pay a fine. Okay? So this is a little abstract. Let's look at an example. Okay? So a simple example here. Alice wants to send funds to Bob. So the transaction comes in which says send money from Alice to Bob. What amount? 100 euros. When? So we want this to be transacted within 10 minutes, yeah? And I want to pay at most 3 cents for this transaction, okay? So the central bank then announces that this transaction has come in, announces it to the set of verifiers, which I've depicted here, going from 1 to n on the left-hand side, for you, right-hand side, okay? So then the verifiers, they just announce their transaction fee requests through the central bank. They say, I commit to verify this transaction within 10 minutes at a price of 1 cent, okay? And then they go through and everybody says so. And then now suppose that this number K, the number of verifiers that would be working on this transaction is 2, okay? So the central bank just looks through all of these suggestions from the verifiers and selects the 2 ones that are most competitive. So that would be here 1 cent from verifier 1 and 0.9 cent from verifier n-1. Okay, this being a second price auction, then the transaction fee is just set by the K plus first transaction fee proposal. So here this would be, in this particular example, 1.1 cent. So the Alice would then have to pay this transaction fee to both verifiers that will do the transaction processing. So her total transaction cost will be 1.1 times 2, which will be less than her limit price, and the transaction will go through, and then we'll work on it. So now let's look at what happens in the next step. Sorry?
K plus 1, it's about it's more money than the 1 cent. Why did you say K plus 1 is 1
That's just the way the Secondprice auction works. So you go through and just pick the price. You don't actually charge. So if I say I bid, if I say I'm willing to do this for 1 cent, okay, and I win the auction, then I don't have to actually do this for 1 cent, but I'll have to do this at the price that the guy who was just worse than me said he wanted to do it. Okay, that's how the Secondprice auction. And the Secondprice auction has some nice properties, and which is why we selected it. Okay, so now the second step is verification and checking. Okay, so we have two cases. There's agreement and disagreement. So if they agree, so if 1 and n-1 both produce the same output, okay, everybody's happy. They both say it's valid. In that case, it will just be added to the ledger, and everybody else, all the other verifiers will be informed, and they will copy that state. If they say it's not valid, then this transaction will be discarded and will not be added to the ledger. So what happens if they disagree? Well, suppose 1 said it's valid, n-1 says it's invalid. In that case, the central bank has to step in, has to resolve the dispute. Okay? And so the central bank will run the check itself, and it will say, well, it's actually invalid. So now I'm going to penalize 1 who said it was invalid, who said it was valid. Okay? So in this case, here, transaction is rejected, and the verifier n-1 receives the fee. Okay? He produced the right output, and the verifier 1, he does not receive the fee and has to pay a fine, which I'll show you later how you could set it. Okay? So there are a few points that are worth noting about this. The system has a few desirable properties. In particular, the verifier has incentives, if you set the fee correctly, okay, has incentive that shirking in the sense of, just producing some output, for example, always producing the most likely transaction validity output is unprofitable, okay? Transactions are processed by those verifiers that can do so in the most cost-effective way, okay? More urgent transactions are processed faster, but they're also more expensive. Manipulation attempts are detected, and they're detected with a probability that's increasing in this set K of verifiers that you use in order to check your transaction. The system remains operational even if some of the verifiers become unavailable. You just have less people operating in the system, which will reduce the competitiveness a little bit, and will therefore push prices up a little bit, but it will still be able to operate. We don't need proof of work consensus algorithm or any other fancy sort of consensus algorithm, so this should be pretty efficient. And us not being computer scientists, we also don't really think about the database technology behind this. So I could imagine this being done in a permission blockchain, but I could also imagine this being done in something else. Obviously, there are some caveats to this, right? So what we cannot take care of in this design is criminal fraud, okay? We cannot exclude the possibility of there being side payments to verifiers that will then incentivize them to do things in the payment system that will be fraudulent. However, we believe that the central bank could then run additional checks in order to detect fraudulent behavior, just like now, for example, the SEC would try to detect insider trading on the New York Stock Exchange. So this is something that is, something that would have to be done, but that's not something that we within the design can exclude, okay? And then finally, the reliance on, the central bank by design having this very central role in our system, makes it arguably a bit less resilient to disruption compared to a fully decentralized solution such as Bitcoin or Ethereum. But we've just heard all of the downsides that come with this system, and it certainly wouldn't satisfy the requirements that we've set. So we believe that that's a compromise that you just have to, that's a trade-off you just have to take. So now I have a little bit of time left. So let me shift gears. So I've talked to you about the proposal. I'll now go into the model. I think we can go over this relatively quickly because it does kind of just formalize the informal ideas that I've tried to make to you now. So let's jump in. So we have users and transactions, right? Users are just the guys who own the accounts. Okay, we don't model them in any more sophisticated way. We just say they have an account with a certain balance, and it then generates transactions at some rate. Okay, we do not consider the incentives of the user, to be frank. So then a transaction is just specified in a very simple way. It's this tuple of, there's a user that sends the amount of money, there's a user that receives the amount of money, then there's an amount of money attached, obviously, then there's a maximum transaction fee, a time at which a transaction was sent, and then this delay parameter which determines how urgent the transaction is, okay? And then a transaction can be in 3 types of states at any given point in time, okay? It can be either pending, meaning that somebody's working on it, somebody's trying to verify it. It can be accepted, meaning that it has been included into the ledger, or it can have been rejected, meaning that it's neither pending nor accepted. So obviously you only want transactions to be included that are valid, right? So how do we define valid transactions? The minimal definition that we could come up with for a valid transaction would be one where, obviously both origination and sending accounts are valid accounts, that these exist. Okay? That the origination account has sufficient balance in order to cover the amount of money that he tries to send and the maximum transaction fee that he's willing to pay. And then also as a third condition, that there is no other transaction that is pending from this particular origination account. The third condition is necessary in order to allow for efficient processing of these transactions in parallel. Okay, otherwise you might worry about inconsistencies that can arrive if an account sends out multiple transactions at the same time and the state has not been updated accordingly. So in order to exclude these inconsistencies, we include this additional condition 3. Now you could also include other things like, for example, anti-money laundering checks and so on. That would also go into this definition, but trying to take an abstract approach, we leave these out. But you could, if you want, include them. Now verifiers, we model them in a very simple way. We just say they have 2 sequential choices to make, okay? The first choice that they face is they can decide to work or shirk, okay? If they decide to work, that means that they are protocol compliant, meaning that if they receive a transaction, they actually go and look at the transaction properties and then decide according to the definition I've just shown you whether or not that is a valid transaction. If they decide to shirk, okay, then they produce some other output, okay? And that other output that they would then produce would be up to them. They could flip a coin, or they could think about, what is the optimal output that I should give now in order to minimize the probability of detection and so on. But shirking just means that you cannot trust the output of this particular verifier. And then finally, they have to decide on the fee of the auction. And you see that this makes sense to do this in a sequential type of decision, because if you decide to shirk, then you don't really need to worry so much about the fee that we would charge, okay? Because you don't need to worry so much about maybe the cost of actually doing the work. So let's look at the payoff structure of the verifier. So you can decompose it into these 2 essential cases. One is the top case would be the one where the verifier does the work, and the bottom case is where the verifier does not do the work. So the X means this is just an indicator variable, which is the function of the bid, so the transaction cost request that you submitted to the auction, and the transaction cost request is all the other verifiers submitted to the auction, okay? So this is the indicator function that determines the allocation of the transaction jobs throughout the auction, okay? And then suppose that X is 1, then if you do the work, you would receive this fee F, okay, for doing the work, and you would have to pay a certain cost C, which is the marginal cost of producing this transaction. We ignore fixed costs, okay? Now, if you decide not to work, okay, then there are 2 outcomes, 2 possible outcomes, okay? So it's provided, again, that you have been allocated the transaction. Okay? The first outcome is you're not detected, everything goes well, okay? Then you just receive the transaction fee, and you don't have any costs, okay? If you are detected, yeah, as in the case of in the example I've just shown you before, if you are detected, then you do not receive the transaction fee, and you would have to pay a particular fine that would be set by the central bank. Okay? So we assume that the verifier has a particular production technology that allows it to process these transactions in parallel at some marginal cost, which is decreasing in this urgency parameter. So the faster it has to produce it, the more costly will be the verification. And the way you can think of this is as these guys having some sort of cloud that where they could just switch on some more CPUs that they rent, okay? And then there's another transaction that comes in, and they need to do it very fast, and they rent more CPUs or less CPUs or more powerful CPUs and so on. Therefore, the cost will be increasing in this urgency parameter. But it will also be increasing in the number of transactions that is already working on right now. So it's a function of the queues of these verifiers, the transactions that they are currently working on, okay? And then we make the simplification that verifiers then choose these actions myopically, okay? They will essentially just, for every incoming transaction, optimize independently, importantly, without communicating with each other. Yes?
So that model, you have not chosen the consensus algorithm yet. You've just defined it, it's not proof of work, right?
Well, I mean, I have kind of defined a consensus algorithm, which is the one that, essentially a voting algorithm in which, if everybody agrees among the K, okay, then it just goes through, and if one of the K does not agree, then the central bank steps in and has the last word, and then that determines output, right? So in this sense, it's a consensus algorithm because there's an input state, it does some job, and then it terminates and it produces an output, okay? All right, so how are transactions allocated? Remember, this is done via Secondprice auction, okay? So Secondprice auction is pretty easy. You have all these transaction fees that are submitted by the verifiers, then you go and sort all of these transaction fees, okay, from lowest to highest, okay, and then the standard allocation in the Secondprice auction would be that everybody who is below or equal to the K-est transaction fee in this increasing sequence of transaction fees gets allocated a job to work on, and everybody else does not. And then the transaction fee is F is equal to the K plus first transaction fee request, okay? And then if there are ties, okay, if there would be, for example, verifiers that submit the same transaction fee, then that tie would be broken randomly, okay? If the fees exceed the maximum fee, the transaction will be rejected. Okay, here's a very short example. Suppose that already in a sort of already ordered sequence, the verifiers had submitted transaction fee requests of 0.1, 0.9, 1.1, and 5. Okay, and this big K would be 2. Then verifier 1 and verifier 2 would both receive the job. Okay, they would now work on this transaction. The fee would be 1.1. Okay, and the profits would be 1 for verifier 1 and 0.2 for verifier 2. So the important takeaway here is that fees are set in a competitive way, but there's still opportunity for profits for the verifiers in this case, depending on how large you will choose K. Okay, that will determine essentially the profits, as I'll show you later. And then I guess this comes back to your question: how does the verification and dispute resolution work? Okay, so there are these two outputs that a verifier has to determine. It's either the two choices that it has, it's either valid or invalid. If all the verifiers among this group of K agree that the transaction is valid or invalid, that is just the output of the consensus algorithm, right? If they disagree, then the central bank steps in and verifies this. And now let me say again, outside of the scope of this setup here is, sophisticated non-protocol compliant strategies. The central bank would have to go and actually try and understand what's going on and check that, make sure that these are not actually occurring. All right, so that's the model. The properties of the system and the evaluation of the system can be done by studying this model a little bit, okay? So the first property I want to talk to you about is security, okay? And this is a very simple proposition where we say that, so if you exclude the possibility of collusion and side payments among the verifiers, and there's at least one honest verifier in the system, then you can show that it's a sufficient condition, okay, for protocol compliance is that the fee you charge is essentially the ratio of the probability of not being detected of being a shirker over the probability of being detected a shirker times the transaction fee of that would be charged for that particular transaction. Okay, and then you add some epsilon over that. The intuition for this proof is pretty simple. Okay, first you note that in a Secondprice auction, the verifiers can always choose their bids such that their utility is non-negative. Okay, and then you say, well, now it will be sufficient if I just make the alternative utility of shirking negative in all states of the world, and the way you achieve that is by setting a sufficiently high fee conditional on a probability of detection Q. Okay, now you should note that this probability of detection Q can actually be quite small. Okay, so suppose, for example, that there's one honest verifier, right, and most of the so that guy you can trust. And now most of the transactions will actually be valid transactions, right? And now, then the optimal strategy of the shirking verifier would be to always say it's valid, right? They will just always pick the outcome that is most likely. They always say valid, valid, valid. And you will only detect that this guy is actually not doing what he's supposed to do when there's actually an invalid transaction coming in. Okay? This does not change the state of the ledger, so it's not amount to manipulation, but it's basically fraud by the verifier who's not contributing to the security of the system. Okay? So in order to detect this, you might want to send some check transactions as a central bank. You just might want to send some invalid transactions in order to increase this probability Q of detection, which would then allow you to lower the penalty that you have to charge in case of detection. Okay? But if there is somebody who actually maliciously wants to force a particular outcome of a transaction verification process, and there's at least one honest verifier, then he will not be able to do this. That will be detected, okay? In that sense, it's a very secure system. And then in terms of efficiency, well, having chosen this as a sort of second price auction, it is well known that verifiers will set their transaction fees such that their transaction fees will just be their marginal costs of processing this particular transaction. So that's the standard result from auction theory, and it also makes it very easy for verifiers to actually participate in these auctions. Okay, they don't have to think about what should be my bid. Okay, they don't have to think strategically about how to participate in this auction. They just have to know what is their marginal cost function. And if they do that, once they know it, they can essentially just automate the whole process, and you can run it very, very efficiently, very quickly, just like Google all the time. Every time you type something into Google, runs an auction in order to determine what are the types of ads that you're going to see next to your search results. Okay, so efficiency in terms of computational efficiency for this type of setup should not be a problem. Now, you might want to know, how do fees depend on the number of verifiers in the system, okay, because the central bank, this is a parameter that the central bank can decide on. How many people should I let into this system, N, and how many people should I pick for each transaction to work? Okay, what should be K? Okay? And the way you can try to model this is to say, well, first of all, you realize because of the setup we've chosen that fees will be essentially driven just by the marginal cost of the verifiers. And what drives the marginal cost? Well, the marginal cost is driven by the length of the queues of these verifiers. Essentially, the marginal cost will be a function of the level of congestion in the system, okay? And then we make some simplifying assumptions about the transaction arrival rate, okay? And essentially the time it takes to process these transactions. And then we can frame this essentially as a Markov chain and try to study the steady state of this Markov chain. Once we have the steady state of the Markov chain, we can say something about what would be the profit in the steady state, what would be the fee in a steady state, okay? So for simplification, we'll assume that all of these verifiers are the same, they have the same cost function, and their cost function in particular will just be a function of the length of the queue rather than other properties of the transactions that are already being in the queue. That's a simplification because, in particular, it could be a function of how fast are they already working on this other transaction, right? I don't think that the cost would depend on that, but it would, in general, you could think of very complicated dependencies on this queue state. The cost could depend in complicated ways on the state of queue, okay? But we simplify this by just saying it depends on the length of the queue. We also assume that the transactions are all homogeneous and they arrive at they have a constant processing delay, so they take a certain fixed amount of time to be processed. And then we say transactions arrive at this Poisson rate lambda, which then determines, essentially the congestion of the system. Or what better said, the ratio of lambda to beta will determine the state of congestion of the system, okay? Now, I don't think I have enough time to go in detail through this, okay, but just sort of trust me that what you can say in the end is that the way the Markov chain will look or the equilibrium state of the Markov chain will look is that the queues will essentially be such that the lengths of the queue will be spread as evenly as possible among all of these n verifiers, but sometimes you cannot spread out all of the transactions that are currently being processed evenly among all verifiers just because of rounding problems. So there will be some differences in the lengths of the queues, and these differences in the lengths of the queues will determine the fees, and they will also determine the profits, okay? Now, you can try to study this analytically, or you can do some simple numerical simulations of this Markov chain, and then you can show that, well, what happens if you increase the number of verifiers, for example? And then as you would expect, right, in a competitive system, as you push out the number of verifiers, you can make the profit arbitrarily large, and you can also push the fee that the verifiers charge arbitrarily close to the marginal cost of processing this one transaction. Okay? So that is just to say that the system has a nice property that it is competitive, as opposed to other systems which tend not to be competitive. Okay? And it also has the property that because the central bank can choose N and can choose K, it has a way of choosing both the level of security of the system by choosing K, and it has a way of deciding what should be roughly the level of competitiveness of the system. How much do I want the verifiers to earn by providing the service, and how low do I want the fees to be for the users of this service? Okay? So to conclude, let me say that current payment systems suffer from a lack of competition and efficiency, as I hope to have convinced you. And the discussion around CBDCs at the moment really requires clear proposals. We try to contribute to this discussion with an auction-based CBDC payment system that achieves high levels of efficiency and security, and that's under the control of the central bank. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, shoot.
Verifiers all do exactly the same job.
Yeah.
Right, protocol requires. Can they do it in different ways?
Yeah, they can.
Some new silicon invention that helps them do it.
They could. I mean, as long as they do the same, follow the same steps, or check the same thing, they could write their own program to do that if they wanted to, that they think is more efficient, therefore it has a lower marginal cost. Sure, or they could use a different computer to do it, whatever, right? So that that system would leave it up to the verifiers to decide. Ultimately, they have to make sure, though, that when they have the same inputs as the central bank, that they produce the same outputs. Okay, that's because that's the standard they have to achieve. Yes.
Could you implement this price detection scheme into the target 2 payment system?
I would think so. You mean this price detection? What do you mean by? You mean this setup?
Competitive scheme, like how to find the correct price for this specific.
Right. I mean, could you implement? I mean, you could not just take target 2 and plug this in, because target 2, as my understanding is, is just a system that is run by the ECB, but it is something that could work for an interbank payment system. The question is this the right thing to do for an interbank payment system? Because as I showed at the beginning, interbank payment systems do not have the same requirements on throughput, and I think probably this ECB is already doing a pretty good job at providing target 2. So the question is then really, if you wanted to scale this up to a larger scale, would target 2 still work, right? And there I have my doubts. Okay? Good. Any more questions? Yeah. Yeah.
But my question to you, actually people behave truthfully if they know the best. If I know that it costs $10, I say $10, $8, I will take the good. It costs $10, and I will pay only $8. That's why it is $2 on normal auction. And here, as I understand, as a verifier, I declare my losses, not my profit. What do I say? Okay, to verify this, it will cost me 1 cent and 1. Or maybe I didn't.
I mean, the auction works in both ways, right? It works if you buy something or if you sell something. But it works in both ways.
Not your loss. Because then you need compensation. And does it make sense if you compensate less?
Would it convince you if I said that a gain is just, or a loss is just a negative gain? It's just a sign change. I mean, it does not. It does not. So the qualitative properties of the auction do not change whether or not this is somebody who will be selling something or somebody who will be buying something. For the exact same reasons that the normal second price auction work.
If I have less compensation than I lost, I will take part of it.
Maybe we can take the discussion offline. All right, any other questions? Then thank you very much for staying around and for the questions and the feedback, and in general for participating in this session, which I think was super interesting. Thank you very much.